The Mafia boss leaned back, swirling his whiskey, and asked the waitress a question that should have gotten her killed. Let's say I wanted to clean up my money. Stop laundering, go legitimate. What would you do? He expected her to stammer, maybe laugh it off. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're building on sand instead of bedrock. Even criminals need sustainable business models." The room went silent. In that moment, Santino Matteo realized two things. This woman knew far too much to be just a waitress, and she might be the only person who could save him from the FBI closing in. What he didn't know, her father's name was in his ledgers, and she'd been planning this conversation for years. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now. If you don't, this could be the last story you catch from me. Your support keeps these emotional, powerful stories coming. And trust me, you won't want to miss this one. The amber liquid in Santino Matteo's glass shimmered as he swirled it slowly, watching the light flicker across its surface. The sharp scent of whiskey lingered in the air, mingling with the rich aroma of freshly baked bread and garlic wafting from the kitchen. It was a quiet evening at Lucia's Trattoria, the upscale Italian restaurant tucked away in a corner of Brooklyn's wealthiest district. The hum of soft conversation and the clink of silverware on fine china created a comforting background symphony. But for Santino, it was nothing more than white noise. Santino sat in his usual corner table, the one by the window where the dim glow of the streetlights filtered through the heavy curtains. He preferred it this way, away from the bustling center of the room, away from the noise, away from being recognized by anyone who might bring up the empire he had built or was about to lose. His thoughts were heavier than the glass of whiskey in his hand. He had no patience for anyone tonight, not even his usual bodyguards who were stationed by the door. With a scowl, he flicked his eyes toward the entrance, where Rosalia Carmine entered carrying a fresh batch of orders. The young waitress had been serving him for weeks now, and though she didn't speak much, her presence always caught his attention. She was unlike any of the other servers, the way she moved through the restaurant with quiet grace, the way she interacted with customers. Never over-eager but confident in her actions. Her modesty was refreshing, even if it was the last thing Santino wanted to admit. Rosalia was in her mid-20s, a few years younger than he, but the difference in their worlds was far greater than mere age. She wore a red apron over a simple pastel blouse, a necklace with a small silver heart pendant resting lightly against her collarbone, a gift from her late mother, she once mentioned. It was a subtle, understated detail that made her seem different from the glossy, attention-seeking women Santino was used to. She had a quiet, almost imperceptible warmth, and that, for some reason, intrigued him. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the rim of his glass, his sharp hazel eyes glinting with a touch of mischief. There was no one else at the table, just the soft hum of background noise, and the flickering of the candle on the table that held his attention for a moment longer than it should have. "Rosalia," Santino said, his voice low, carrying that hint of command even when he wasn't trying. She turned her head, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before walking over with a polite smile. "Yes, Mr. Matteo? How can I help you?" He didn't bother with pleasantries. He was in the mood to amuse himself. "I've got a question for you," he said with a smirk, his gaze flicking to the corner of his mouth. "Let's say, hypothetically, I wanted to clean up my financial situation. You know, move some money around, stop laundering, maybe get a little legitimate." Rosalia's eyes didn't flinch. She just stood there, pen in hand, waiting for him to continue. He could already sense the skepticism in her, the way she wasn't immediately charmed by his playful arrogance. That, too, caught his attention. "Hypothetically?" she repeated, a slight quirk in her lips. "That sounds like a big step for someone like you." Santino chuckled softly, leaning forward as his fingers drummed the table lightly. "I'm always looking for the next big move. But here's the catch. I'm not talking about stocks or bonds. I need real advice, not some bullshit buy low, sell high garbage." Rosalia raised an eyebrow, slightly amused by his bluntness. She adjusted the notepad in her hand, her expression unreadable. "Well, if you're serious about it, there's always the option of real estate. The market is ripe for development in the city right now, especially when it comes to affordable housing projects. You could use your current resources to back some legitimate ventures that would actually get you tax breaks." Santino's smirk faltered slightly. replaced by genuine curiosity. He leaned back in his chair, eyeing her with newfound interest. She was far more composed than the women he usually encountered, but more than that, her response didn't sound like she was guessing. It was deliberate and far too well informed. "You're saying I could just get into real estate?" he asked slowly, the edges of his amusement giving way to something more serious. "And do what? Build houses for poor people?" Rosalia's gaze never wavered. "Not just houses. Real estate development is a multi-layered game. You can get involved in private equity too, emerging markets, hospitality chains, even renewable energy sectors. Your problem isn't moving the money, it's that you're building on sand instead of bedrock. Even criminals need sustainable business models. You can't keep doing what you're doing forever." Santino blinked. Her words struck a chord. He hadn't expected such a comprehensive response, let alone one so precise. He took a moment to process, the whiskey forgotten for the time being. "You don't think I could just invest in some stocks and call it a day?" He said it with the same light-heartedness, but there was a deeper question hidden there, one he wasn't used to voicing. "No, not unless you want to risk everything," Rosalia replied bluntly. "If you really want to be legit, you need a diversified portfolio, something that ties your money up in long-term profitable ventures, real estate, energy, even healthcare. The key is to invest in projects that have a solid foundation, not just things that will make a quick buck and fade into the background." Santino was quiet for a moment. He had to admit, he hadn't expected this. He wasn't exactly sure why he had asked her in the first place. Maybe it had been the way she carried herself, that quiet confidence that wasn't easily shaken. Maybe it was the fact that her words were grounded in truth. But something about her had caught his attention. He finally broke the silence with a low chuckle. "And here I thought I was the one with the answers around here." Rosalia's smile was subtle, a slight upturn of her lips. "Maybe you just needed to ask the right person." There it was again, her unflinching composure, the way she didn't back down, didn't cower beneath his gaze. It was the first time in a long while that Santino had felt anything resembling respect for someone who wasn't part of his world. He set his glass down, the weight of his earlier amusement shifting into something far more real. "You know," he said, his voice deeper, more serious than before, "I've got to admit, you're not what I expected." "I'm just a waitress," she said, with a shrug that dismissed her own words. "But I know how to read numbers, and I've spent enough time around people who think they're untouchable to understand what works and what doesn't." Santino didn't respond immediately, his mind turning over the possibility of what she was suggesting. The chaos of his criminal empire was beginning to overwhelm him, and the idea of pivoting, of taking his wealth into something legitimate, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Tell you what," he said slowly, eyeing her carefully. "Why don't you sit down with me tomorrow? I'll make it worth your while. We can talk more about this legitimate plan of yours, maybe even see where we can take it." Rosalia met his gaze, her eyes sharp. "I'll come, but only if you stop treating this like a joke." Santino raised an eyebrow, a smile creeping back onto his face. "Fair enough. I think we have a deal then." As Rosalia turned to leave, her posture straight, her simple silver necklace gleaming faintly, Santino watched her go with a feeling he couldn't quite place. Respect, curiosity, maybe even something deeper. She had just given him the first piece of advice that felt like it could actually save him. For the first time in years, Santino Matteo found himself considering a future he hadn't dared to imagine before. And it was all because of a waitress who had dared to speak her mind. Santino Matteo spent the entire night replaying their conversation in his head. There was something about Rosalia Carmine that gnawed at him, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit quite right, but still demanded his attention. He'd asked her that simple, mocking question about financial advice, expecting a dumbfounded stare or at best a vague, meaningless answer. Instead, she'd given him something far more valuable: clarity. And in that clarity, something he hadn't realized he was seeking. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was losing control of a situation, and yet somehow, that didn't make him uncomfortable. It intrigued him. As he sat at his desk later that night, sorting through the increasingly disorganized chaos of his criminal empire, his mind wandered back to her words. Even criminals need sustainable business models. She hadn't just spoken about money or real estate. She'd spoken of something deeper, something about building a future, about leaving behind a legacy that wasn't built on lies, greed, and blood. Santino shook his head, trying to push those thoughts aside. He wasn't a sentimental man, nor was he one to embrace change. He'd built his empire on risk, on pushing boundaries. It was why he sat where he did, on top of the food chain. No, he didn't need a change of heart. But maybe, just maybe, a change of business model wouldn't be the worst thing for him. As the clock ticked on, Santino found his thoughts returning to Rosella. He couldn't get her out of his head, the way her blue eyes had locked onto his, unflinching, as she delivered her response. That quiet, calm confidence. She wasn't like the other women who fawned over him, trying to win his favor with empty flattery or desperate attempts to impress. No, Rosalia didn't care about his money, his power, or even the threat that hovered over every word he spoke. She'd simply stated the truth. Santino leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the desk. She had caught his attention in a way no one else ever had. And now, he couldn't help but wonder what she could do for him. If she could truly help him turn his empire legitimate, maybe she was the answer to a problem he'd been ignoring for far too long. The following evening, Rosalia's shift was ending, and she was preparing to leave when she felt a presence behind her. She turned, expecting another regular customer to ask for a last-minute refill on wine or make a joke about her being the fastest waitress in the city. Instead, it was Santino. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and calculating, but with an undertone of curiosity that she hadn't expected. "Rosalia," he said, his voice low. "I need to talk to you. Stay after your shift. We've got business to discuss." She paused, her mind racing as she searched for a polite way to refuse. She wasn't foolish enough to ignore the danger lurking in his words. Santino Matteo was the last person she wanted to be alone with after hours. He wasn't just a mafia boss. He was a predator, always sizing up his next move, always looking for someone to manipulate to get what he wanted. But then she remembered his words from last night, their conversation about financial stability, about legitimacy, and something in her shifted. Maybe this was an opportunity. Maybe it wasn't just another day in a dead-end job, waiting tables for people who barely noticed she existed. Reluctantly, she nodded. "All right, I'll stay." Santino gave her a quick, approving nod before turning to head toward the back of the restaurant, where the private office was located. Rosalia followed him, her heartbeat quickening as she tried to read him. What did he want with her? Was he serious about the advice she'd given him? Or was he just bored and looking for someone to toy with? When she entered the office, Santino was already seated behind a large oak desk, leaning back in the chair with his hands folded over his stomach. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken tension in the air. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Rosalia took a seat, her back straight as she folded her arms across her chest. She wasn't going to let her guard down, not with him. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said last night," Santino began, his tone more serious now. "And I'll admit, I didn't expect you to be so knowledgeable." She didn't respond immediately, watching him closely as he shifted in his seat, clearly considering his next words. "I need help, Rosalia," he continued, his voice surprisingly earnest. "The empire I've built, it's crumbling. The FBI's breathing down my neck, and the money I've been moving, it's only a matter of time before it all falls apart." Rosalia remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Her mind running through every possible reason why this conversation wasn't just a prelude to another manipulative scheme. She had no doubt Santino wanted something from her. But the question was, what? "Legitimate businesses don't deal in dirt and blood," Santino said, as if reading her mind. "I want to change that. I want to clean up the mess I've made. And I need someone who knows how to do it." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he seriously asking her to help him turn his entire empire into something legal? It was madness, but it was also tempting. "And you want me to help you?" she asked cautiously, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. Santino's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in him, a side that was hidden beneath the tough exterior. "Yes, he said simply. You've got the brains. I've got the resources. If you're willing, I'll make sure you're taken care of. No more waitressing. No more living paycheck to paycheck. You'll be my consultant, my partner. Rosalia felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had imagined Santino would offer her money, maybe a favor here and there. But this was something entirely different. A partnership? Why me? She asked, not bothering to hide the wariness in her voice. You could hire anyone for this kind of thing. Santino leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Because you're the only person I've ever met who speaks the truth, no matter who's listening. You didn't back down when I challenged you. And that's exactly what I need right now. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me what I don't want to hear. Rosalia's stomach tightened as she processed his words. He was offering her a way out of the life she hated, the life that had been forced upon her after her father's debts crushed her family. She could almost taste the promise of freedom, of something better than the grind of waiting tables for a meager salary. But the cost was steep. Santino's empire wasn't just built on money, it was built on destruction. Helping him meant becoming entangled in a world of crime, deceit, and danger. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a dangerous proposition. And yet the idea of something more, of helping him turn everything around, called to her. I'll help you, she said, her voice firm now, but on one condition. Santino raised an eyebrow. What condition? I want full control over the transition, she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. I'll help you, but you're not making any moves without my say-so. If I'm going to be involved in this, I'm doing it my way. Santino's lips curled into a slow smile, one that was both approving and intrigued. I think you just might be the kind of person I need. And just like that, Santino Matteo had a new partner in crime, or in this case, in redemption. The question now wasn't whether they could turn his empire legitimate. It was whether Rosalia could live with the choices that would come next. The next few days passed in a blur of papers, meetings, and quiet conversations. Santino and Rosalia's partnership, which had started as an unlikely proposition, was quickly becoming a more serious venture. Every time Santino looked at her, he found himself more and more impressed by her sharp intellect. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor was she trying to impress him. There was something real in her, something authentic, and that made her dangerous to him in ways he couldn't quite understand. In the beginning, it had been easy. Santino made it clear from the start that he wanted to clean up his empire, to transform the wealth that had been built on lies into something sustainable. Rosalia, in turn, laid out a clear strategy. She didn't sugarcoat it. She had no intention of allowing him to cut corners. But despite her straightforward approach, she kept her distance, reminding herself constantly of why she was here, to help him transition, to avoid falling too deep into this world, and to protect herself from getting lost in the chaos. Santino sat across from her now, leaning back in his chair as she tapped a pencil against her notepad. They were in his private office, the same dark wood furniture, the same heavy silence hanging between them. But today, something felt different. You've been talking about real estate a lot, he said, breaking the silence. His voice was casual, but there was a hard edge to it. What's the deal with it? Rosalia had already anticipated his resistance to the idea. He wasn't one for slow-moving, formal investments, especially ones that didn't promise immediate, tangible returns. But she wasn't here to placate him. She was here to change the game. Real estate is stable, she said, her voice calm but firm. It's long-term, and it's essential for diversification. You're sitting on millions in cash, but most of it is tied up in short-term, high-risk ventures. You need something that will provide steady income, something that can weather the market's fluctuations. Santino frowned. I didn't get into this business by sitting on my hands waiting for things to grow. I take risks. I control things. Real estate doesn't do that for me. Rosalia paused, considering his words. It was clear that he was uncomfortable with the thought of surrendering control. It was a stark contrast to the business model he had built his empire on: risk, power, intimidation. Real estate was about stability, and Santino's world wasn't stable. That's exactly why you need it, she said carefully, leaning forward. Your current empire is built on sand. The more you rely on those high-risk operations, the sooner it'll all come crashing down. But if you start moving into real estate, buying up properties, developing them, you'll have a foundation you can stand on. It's not about control, Santino. It's about sustainability. Santino remained quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening as he stared at the paperwork in front of him. She could see the gears turning in his mind. He didn't like it. He didn't like the idea of anything being out of his control. But he also wasn't a fool. He knew the importance of having a stable income. "I'll take your word for it," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. Rosalia let out a quiet breath, relieved that he hadn't dismissed the idea entirely. But she knew this was just the beginning. Santino had no intention of changing overnight, and she couldn't force him to. She would have to show him, step by step, that her approach worked, that it would benefit them both in the long run. The following weeks were a mixture of meetings, strategy sessions, and tense silences. Santino was growing increasingly disillusioned with the slow pace of business and the constant stream of legal paperwork. He wanted action, and Rosalia could see his frustration mounting. Every time they discussed a new project or investment, he pushed back, questioning everything she suggested. It was as though he couldn't stop himself from sabotaging the very progress they needed. "Why can't we just buy into something simple? You know, like a few casinos or high-end clubs. The kind of thing that moves money quickly," he said one day, pacing in front of her desk. Rosalia met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not about quick money anymore. That's the whole point. You've built an empire on fast cash, and now it's collapsing because of it. You need to invest in things that will last, things that won't come under investigation, that won't leave you vulnerable to the law. We can't keep running from the FBI forever." Santino stopped pacing and looked at her for a long moment. He was silent, the tension between them palpable. He wanted to argue, to shut her down. But something in her words lingered. As the weeks passed, Rosalia continued to break down complex financial concepts for him, explaining the value of long-term growth, asset diversification, and sustainable industries. Slowly, he began to understand the weight of what she was proposing. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival, his survival. And the idea of leaving behind his criminal world, however difficult it was for him to accept, seemed like the only way forward. Despite his growing respect for her expertise, Rosalia felt herself becoming more and more entrenched in a life she had vowed to avoid. Every day, she saw the cracks in Santino's world, the weight of his empire threatening to pull him under. But it wasn't just his world she was seeing, it was hers too. Santino's operations, the ones she had been helping him transform, held the very debts that had destroyed her family. Her father had been a gambler, always one step away from bankruptcy, always trying to claw his way out of debt. But the debts weren't just from gambling, they came from Santino's loan sharking operations. She hadn't known that when she first agreed to work with him, but now, as she delved deeper into his financial records, it became impossible to ignore. Her father's debts had been inflated, manipulated. Santino's empire had used her father as a pawn, knowing full well that he would be pushed to his limits, his desperate attempts to pay off the loans ultimately leading him into bankruptcy and into the grave. Rosalia's heart clenched with anger, her fists tightening as she flipped through the pages of the ledger. The discovery had shaken her to the core. She had known the Mafia was ruthless. She had known Santino's world was built on destruction. But to learn that he had been indirectly responsible for her father's death, it was too much to bear. One night, as they sat across from each other, going over yet another set of numbers, Rosalia finally spoke, her voice tight with restraint. "Santino, I need to ask you something." He looked up, his usual calm demeanor giving way to something more curious. "What's on your mind?" "Your operations, your loan sharking businesses. My father, his debts were tied to you. I just didn't realize how deep it went until now." Santino's expression faltered for just a split second before he masked it again. "I didn't know your father personally, Rosalia. But I'm not blind. I knew about his debts. I know the risks of that business." Her anger flared. "Risks? My father died because of those risks. He wasn't just some statistic to be tossed aside. And now you're asking me to help you make everything legal after all the damage you've caused?" Santino's face hardened, the mask of control slipping back into place. I didn't kill your father, Rosalia. I didn't make him take those loans. No, she said, her voice cold. But you kept him in the game, knowing he couldn't win. You manipulated the situation, and now you want me to help you fix your empire? There was a long silence between them. Santino's gaze never wavered, but there was something in his eyes that made Rosalia pause. Guilt? Regret? Or was it just another strategy, another way to keep her close? She didn't know. But what she did know was that she was trapped. She had already agreed to help him, and the deeper she went into his world, the harder it would be to get out. But the stakes were higher now. She had a choice to make. Could she forgive him? Could she help him rebuild, knowing what he had taken from her? Her moral compass, the one that had kept her grounded, was shaking, its needle swinging wildly between vengeance and redemption. The soft hum of the office's air conditioning did little to cool the thick tension between them. Santino Matteo, usually so controlled, was leaning over the table, reviewing documents with the kind of focus that only a man who had spent years running a criminal empire could muster. He sat with a glass of whiskey in hand, occasionally looking up at Rosalia, who was seated across from him, flipping through the financial records with growing discomfort. It had been weeks since they'd agreed to work together. The plan had always been to help Santino transition his criminal empire into something legitimate, and with each day, the process seemed to go slower than Rosalia had expected. But the more they worked, the more she realized how deep the web of corruption ran. And the more she uncovered, the more she couldn't ignore the harsh truth staring her in the face. She had hoped that by now, their work would be focused on new investments, not rehashing old sins. Yet as she sifted through the carefully organized ledgers, one name kept surfacing again and again. Carmine. Her father's name. At first she thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a different Carmine, but the more she looked, the clearer it became. The debt her father had still owed, was tied to Santino's loan sharking operations. She could feel the blood rushing to her face as she flipped the page, her hands tightening around the documents in front of her. The numbers were astronomical. Her father's debts had been deliberately inflated, doubled, tripled over the course of several years. And the more she read, the clearer it became. He was set up to fail from the very beginning. A cold wave of fury washed over her. All this time she had told herself that her father's downfall was his own doing. He was a gambler, reckless, irresponsible. But this was something else entirely. Santino's organization had manipulated him, suffocated him with debt he couldn't possibly pay, and when he couldn't make good on it, they had collected, one way or another. Rosalia's breath came in shallow gasps. She couldn't hold back anymore. Without thinking, she stood up, knocking her chair back with a loud scrape. "Santino!" she snapped, her voice sharp and strained. "How could you do this? How could you be responsible for this?" Santino looked up from his papers, his expression unchanging. His piercing gaze flicked over her, the sharpness in his eyes never faltering. He didn't say anything, but the silence between them felt like an accusation. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped toward him, holding up the ledger in front of her. You destroyed my family. You killed him." Her voice cracked with the weight of the accusation. "You ruined my father's life, and you did it on purpose. You made sure he couldn't escape." Santino's face twitched slightly, his usual calm facade slipping for just a moment. He remained still, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's part of the game, Rosalia," he said, his voice low and resigned. "The Mafia doesn't operate on mercy. It's a system, and sometimes people fall through the cracks. Your father made a choice. He got in over his head. He knew the risks." "No!" she yelled, the frustration and pain spilling out. "He didn't know. You made him take on those debts. You trapped him. I've spent my whole life believing he was just weak, that he was just a fool. But you were the one who played him." Santino stood up then, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he came face to face with her. He was taller than her, more imposing, but in that moment, she didn't feel intimidated by him. She was furious at what he had done, at what he had taken from her. "I didn't kill your father, Rosalia," he said quietly, his voice steely. "I didn't force him to gamble. He chose that life. But I didn't make him die either." Rosalia was shaking with anger. She wanted to throw the ledger in his face, to force him to see the truth in her eyes. But she didn't. Instead, she folded the papers carefully and placed them back on the table. She turned away, wiping away the hot tears that had started to well up in her eyes. Santino's voice followed her. "But I didn't leave your father to rot in debt. I'm not the one who buried him under that weight. That was never my plan." She faced him again, unable to hold back any longer. "Then what was your plan, Santino? To run the world on blood money forever? To just keep playing the game until everyone is destroyed?" Santino's gaze softened for the briefest moment, the cold exterior cracking just enough for her to see a flicker of vulnerability. "I didn't start this empire to destroy people. But I can't change what's been done. You think I don't know what I've sacrificed, the people I've hurt?" Rosalia's anger simmered, but something in his words stopped her cold. There was a weight behind them, an honesty that she hadn't expected. Santino wasn't denying his crimes. He wasn't trying to play the victim. He was admitting the truth in the way that only someone who had lived a life of hard choices could. She crossed her arms, her voice quieter now, tinged with something that resembled curiosity. "Then why are you doing this? Why try to go legit now?" Santino stepped closer, his expression more serious than it had ever been in their conversations. "Because I don't want to die with nothing but blood on my hands. I don't want my empire to collapse on itself. I want to leave something that matters, something that lasts." There it was again, the vulnerability. He wasn't just a man protecting his empire. He was someone who realized that the end was near, someone who wanted redemption before it was too late. She took a deep breath, her anger giving way to something else, something more complicated. She didn't know whether to hate him for what he'd done or respect him for the honesty he had just shown her. She couldn't erase the pain of her father's death, nor could she ignore the role Santino had played in it. But there was a part of her, a small, reluctant part, that saw something in him, a chance at redemption. Santino's eyes softened, the hard edge in them dulling just enough for her to see something real. "I have less than 2 years to live, Rosalia," he said quietly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "A heart condition. It's been in my family for generations. I don't have time to rebuild everything from the ground up. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking for your help to build something that isn't just about money, something that will outlast me." The words struck her like a punch to the gut. She had known he was powerful, ruthless even, but she hadn't known how fragile he truly was. His empire, his bravado, it was all built on the fragility of life itself. "You could have told me this sooner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't," Santino replied. "I was too busy trying to hold everything together. I didn't think I could afford to let anyone in, but now I can't keep running anymore." The weight of the moment settled in her chest. She knew what he was asking of her. He wasn't just asking for her help. He was asking for her trust. And in that moment, she realized that he had already crossed a line he couldn't undo. Santino wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who needed to make something of his life before it was too late. Rosalia looked at him, the fury still burning in her veins, but also something else. A strange, reluctant sympathy. He had hurt her family, but maybe, just maybe, he was offering her a chance to turn things around. With a long, steadying breath, she made her decision. "I'll help you, but don't think for a second that your past actions can be erased so easily." Santino nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I'll do whatever it takes." As the chapter closed, Rosalia knew that what she had agreed to would change everything. She was stepping into a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, but for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she knew it was a chance she had to take. The tension in the air had thickened over the past few weeks, like the calm before a storm. Santino Matteo had been slowly transitioning his empire into legitimate businesses, but even as his money flowed into real estate, hospitality, and private equity, the shadow of the FBI loomed larger each day. Rosalia could feel it. The government's investigation into his criminal activities was gaining steam, and every step they took toward legitimacy only seemed to raise more suspicion. Each day that passed, the pressure mounted on her. The FBI knew too much, more than Santino realized. They were closing in on him, inch by inch, and it was only a matter of time before they would have enough to bring him down. But they weren't just interested in Santino anymore. They were watching Rosalia closely. She'd known this was coming. She had always known that working with Santino came with risks, more than just the risk of moral compromise. The FBI had reached out to her on multiple occasions before, but she'd always brushed them off. They'd never been serious. But now, they were persistent. A new agent had been assigned to her case, and his approach was different. He wasn't asking for her cooperation. He was offering it as an ultimatum. Rosalia sat alone in her apartment, the only light coming from the soft glow of the streetlights outside. The weight of the day's conversation still pressed down on her chest. The agent had been clear. Help the FBI take down Santino, and we'll clear your name. No more waiting tables, no more hiding. It was a tempting offer, one that would put an end to the life she had built around lies and fear. Her father's debts, Santino's role in their destruction, the Mafia world she had become entangled in, all of it could be wiped clean if she just cooperated. But something inside her refused to give in. She had spent years living under a different name, watching the world pass by while she kept her head down. Now that she had a chance to make a real difference, now that she had the power to help Santino redeem himself, she wasn't ready to give that up. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her reverie. She picked it up and saw that it was a message from Santino. "We need to meet. I've got something important to discuss. Can you come by tonight?" Rosalia's fingers hovered over the screen. She knew exactly what important meant in Santino's world. She wasn't naive enough to believe that everything was going smoothly. There were too many moving parts, too many dangerous people in the mix for Santino's transition to be as seamless as he wanted it to be. The fact that he was reaching out to her now, at this moment, felt ominous. But despite the weight of her dilemma, her heart twisted at the thought of seeing him. She had gotten used to their quiet partnership, the way they worked together, sometimes silently, sometimes with heated debates, but always with a shared understanding. Santino trusted her, and that trust had begun to feel like a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. She quickly typed a reply. "I'll be there in an hour." When Rosalia arrived at Santino's office, he was already waiting for her, standing by the window, looking out at the city below. The dim light cast shadows across his face, making him look more worn than usual. She could see it in his eyes. There was something on his mind, something he hadn't shared with her yet. "Come in," he said without turning around, his voice low and filled with an unspoken tension. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "What's going on?" she asked, crossing the room to where he stood. He finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. "The FBI's been watching me. I think they know about the shift we've been making. They're getting closer." Rosalia felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. They were being hunted. "I know," she said quietly, the weight of the situation heavy between them. "They've been contacting me. The agent said they can clear my name, but they want me to help them take you down." Santino's jaw tightened and his eyes darkened. "And you're thinking about it?" She shook her head. "No, but they're making it harder to ignore. They're not going to stop." Santino ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I can't let them get to me. We can't let them win. Not now, not after everything I've built, not when I'm so close to turning this around." She watched him closely, her heart heavy with both fear and something else, something she hadn't been able to name until now. She could see the cracks in his facade. He wasn't just fighting for his empire anymore. He was fighting for his legacy. "Then we fight back," she said, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. "We do this right, Santino. We finish what we started. No more hiding." He met her gaze, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced with something darker, something she couldn't quite place. "I don't have time for anything else," he said, his voice firm. "I've got to make sure this works, no matter the cost." Later that evening, as Rosalia returned to her apartment, her mind raced. The agent's offer still hung heavily in the air. She could take the deal, expose Santino, and be free of the Mafia's grip forever. No more fear, no more deception. But what would she have left? She could already see herself sitting in witness protection, a shadow of the woman she had been, cut off from everything she knew. It wasn't the life she wanted, not when she was finally starting to feel like she had a chance at something real. The decision was getting harder to make. She wanted to believe in Santino, to believe that his desire for redemption wasn't just a ploy to escape his fate, but could she trust him fully? Could she trust herself to make the right choice? She had always been a pragmatist, a survivor. But now, as she stared at the flashing phone on her nightstand, a new question lingered in her mind. What happens when survival isn't enough anymore? The next day, things began to unravel faster than Rosalia could have anticipated. Santino's trusted underboss, Marco, had been acting strange, but she hadn't thought much of it at first. Marco had always been a schemer, but lately his behavior was different. There was an edge to his demeanor now, a coldness that hadn't been there before, and today it became clear why. Santino's plan for legitimacy, his shift away from the traditional mafia methods, was too much for Marco to accept. Marco didn't see it as an opportunity, he saw it as weakness. He believed that if Santino truly followed through with his plans, his empire would crumble. And so, Marco had made his choice. The very man Santino had trusted to help him transform. Everything had turned on him. It wasn't just a betrayal. Marco had been feeding information to the FBI all along. Rosalia's stomach churned as the realization hit her. Marco had been playing both sides, working with the very agency they were trying to avoid. But worse than that, he had been planning a coup, a silent takeover of Santino's operation. He saw Santino's plan for a legitimate future as a threat to his power, and he was willing to eliminate both Santino and Rosalia to secure his place at the top. The message came through her phone, sharp and urgent. Marco set it in motion. We've got to act now. Santino had no idea, and Rosalia, despite everything, knew that she had to protect him. He trusted her, and now she was the only one who could stop Marco before it was too late. The chapter ends with Rosalia staring at the phone, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on her. She had thought she was walking a dangerous line with Santino, but now, the line between loyalty and survival had blurred completely. Marco was playing a game that she hadn't expected, and she knew that to survive she'd have to make a choice that would change everything. Who could she really trust now? And how far was she willing to go to protect the man who had built everything on the very principles she had tried to escape? The tension in the air was thick and suffocating, a palpable hum of danger that buzzed beneath the surface of the night. Rosalia's heart raced as she stood in the dimly lit warehouse compound, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. The sound of footsteps echoed through the empty expanse, the clang of metal doors being shut and locked, and then the low murmur of voices. Marco's voice, unmistakable and commanding, sliced through the cacophony of fear building inside her. "Get her in here," he barked, and Rosalia felt the cold touch of steel at her back as one of Marco's men grabbed her roughly by the arm, pulling her toward the center of the warehouse. She had known this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to hit like this, so suddenly, so violently. Marco, Santino's trusted underboss, had been playing a dangerous game, working behind the scenes to undermine Santino's efforts at legitimacy. Now, his betrayal had escalated into something far more dangerous, a hostile takeover of Santino's empire. And Rosalia, unwittingly, had become a pawn in his twisted plan. The warehouse was stark, empty except for the rows of crates and equipment that lined the walls. It was the kind of place Santino used for his more discreet operations, far from prying eyes. And now it was the site of Marco's coup, a coup that would tear everything Santino had worked for apart. Rosalia was shoved into the center of the room, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Marco was standing at the far end, flanked by two of his men, his sharp gaze fixed on her with cold calculation. He hadn't said much to her yet, but she knew he didn't need to. He'd already made his demands clear to Santino. "Where is he?" Marco's voice rang out, his tone demanding. She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan, trying to figure out how to get out of this alive. The situation was dire. Marco had control, but there was still a chance. Her chance to turn things around. "Marco, this isn't how it's supposed to be," she finally said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her gut. You're making a mistake. Marco's lips twisted into a grim smile, his eyes narrowing with disdain. A mistake? No, Rosalia, this is the only way forward. Santino's plan to go legit is weak. He's soft. I'm taking control. Her chest tightened as she realized what this meant. Marco wasn't just going to take over Santino's legitimate businesses. He was going to tear the entire empire down and rebuild it in his own image, a world of violence and bloodshed, the very world she had spent so much of her life trying to escape. You'll get nothing from me, she shot back, her voice defiant. You're not in control anymore, Marco. You're losing. Marco's men exchanged nervous glances, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in Marco's eyes. He was used to having power, to being the one in control. But now, Rosalia was starting to see cracks in his armor. Suddenly, the sound of engines roaring outside shattered the tense silence. The unmistakable screech of police sirens filled the air, and Rosalia's heart dropped into her stomach. The FBI had arrived. As the men scrambled to their positions, Rosalia knew it was too late to run, too late to fight back. The FBI wasn't just here to take down Santino, they were here for her too. She had been caught between two worlds, and now she had to make a choice. She had to play her hand carefully. FBI agents stormed the compound, their boots heavy against the concrete floor, guns raised and commands shouted. The atmosphere shifted from tension to chaos in an instant, and Rosalia's mind was working overtime, calculating every possible move. But Marco wasn't about to back down. He ordered his men to keep their guns trained on Rosalia as he moved toward the door, ready to face the incoming federal agents. His voice was low, almost calm, as he issued one final command to his men. Don't let them take her, and make sure Santino doesn't get away. As the agents began to move in, Rosalia realized the gravity of the situation. Marco had planned this well. He'd coordinated with the FBI, but he hadn't anticipated that they were after him too. Before she could process any of it, a figure appeared at the door, Santino. His dark eyes locked on hers, and for a brief moment she saw the man she had come to know over the past weeks, the man who had trusted her, the man who had been fighting for redemption. But the reality of the situation hit him hard. He saw Marco and his men, the FBI agents closing in, and the chaos unfolding. He stepped forward, his hand gripping the gun at his side, but before he could make a move, Marco's men held Rosalia in place, pulling her to the center of the room. Let her go, Santino growled, his voice low and dangerous, but Marco's grip on the situation was still strong. You don't control this anymore, Santino, Marco taunted, his gun aimed at Rosalia's head. I'm in charge now. Sign over your legitimate holdings and offshore accounts. Now, or I'll put a bullet in her. The room went silent. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped, and all eyes were on Santino. Rosalia's heart was in her throat, the fear of what would happen next overwhelming her. Santino's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to let Marco win, not like this. But the risk of losing Rosalia, losing her trust, losing everything he had worked for was too much. And then it happened. In a flash of movement, Marco's men pulled the trigger, and before anyone could react, Santino had stepped in front of Rosalia, taking the bullet meant for her. The world seemed to slow as Rosalia watched Santino stumble back, his hands clutching his side where the blood began to seep through his shirt. The FBI agents surged forward, and chaos erupted in every direction. Gunshots echoed, men shouted, and in the midst of it all, Rosalia's focus was on Santino. He had taken a bullet for her. Santino, she screamed, rushing to his side. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to stop the bleeding. He was alive, but barely. The pain in his eyes was unmistakable as he looked up at her, his face pale. Get me out of here, Rosalia, he murmured. I can't go down like this. His words were a plea, a request for her help. She could feel the weight of the situation crashing down on her. But she wasn't about to let him die, not like this, not after everything. Using the knowledge she had acquired in the Treasury Department, Rosalia immediately took control. She barked orders to the FBI agents around her, using her insider knowledge of financial crimes to negotiate Santino's medical extraction. She wasn't just going to let the FBI take him. She was going to make sure he was alive to face whatever came next. As they rushed Santino to the hospital, Rosalia sat beside him in the ambulance, her hands pressed against his chest, trying to keep him awake. The sounds of the sirens were deafening, but in the back of her mind, she was already calculating what came next. She had to make a decision. The FBI had offered her immunity. They had promised her freedom. All she had to do was betray Santino. But Santino had just sacrificed himself for her. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. No matter the cost, she would protect him. She would protect the man who had shown her more than just power, who had shown her vulnerability, trust, and a desire for redemption. The chapter ended with Santino being rushed into the emergency room and Rosalia standing at the doorway, torn between the promises the FBI had made and the loyalty she felt to the man who had taken a bullet for her. It was a crossroads she hadn't expected to face, and yet there she was, unsure of what to do next. The air in the room was thick with tension. Santino Matteo stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his gaze fixed on the faces of the men who had been the cornerstone of his empire for years, the 5 families. The men who controlled more than just the streets of New York, they controlled the very lifeblood of Santino's world. And now, he was about to challenge them, to present an idea that would shift everything they knew, everything they had worked for, into something they couldn't understand. Beside him stood Rosalia Carmine, the woman who had become not just his most trusted advisor, but his partner in this dangerous game of redemption. She had insisted on standing by him through this. No longer just a consultant, she was now an equal player, and the weight of their shared venture settled heavily on her shoulders. Santino's eyes swept the room, taking in the hardened faces of the men who had always been his superiors. Each of them was a pillar of the underworld, their expressions cold, calculating, indifferent to the change Santino was about to propose. The power that had built the 5 families was rooted in illegal wealth, drug trafficking, extortion, and violence. Santino's plan to transition it into legitimate businesses was the kind of suggestion that could cost him everything. And in that room, the very idea of going legit was seen as a betrayal. "Gentlemen," Santino began, his voice steady, though a flicker of doubt passed through his chest, "I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my proposal. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about money. It's about survival. For all of us." He glanced at Rosalia, who gave him a quick nod of reassurance. She had been his rock, offering clarity and guidance when he needed it most. Now, as he stood before the 5 families, he realized just how much of this was on her as well. It wasn't just about his redemption anymore. It was about theirs. "I've spent years building this empire, and yes, it's been profitable," Santino continued, his voice low but confident. "But it's also been unstable. It's crumbling. The money we've made is tied to blood, to violence, to things that can't last forever. What I'm proposing is a way forward, a way to move into industries that are not only profitable, but sustainable." A murmur ran through the room. The men exchanged skeptical glances, some shaking their heads subtly, others clearly annoyed by the very thought of legitimacy. The air was charged with disapproval. Santino had always been bold, but this was something else entirely. Real estate development, private equity, hospitality chains. These are the industries we can take over. We can control the flow of capital without relying on the old methods. It's not just about money. It's about building something that will last beyond us, beyond this life of crime. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in, but before anyone could speak, Don Vincenzo, the oldest of the 5, spoke up, his voice thick with disdain. "Are you asking us to turn our backs on everything we've built?" Don Vincenzo's tone was harsh, mocking. "To trade in our power for, what, a few condos in the city? Some hotels? This is madness, Santino. You've always been a good earner, but this is betrayal. You want to leave everything behind and go play in the legal world like some businessman?" Santino held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm not asking you to leave everything behind. I'm asking you to survive. Our world is dying, Vincenzo. The feds are onto us. We can't keep running the same scams and extortions forever. We need to diversify. We need to evolve. The mafia that built this empire is not the mafia that can sustain it. I'm offering us a way forward." Don Salvatore, the most calculating of the group, leaned forward, his fingers tapping the table as he stared at Santino, sizing him up. "And why should we trust you? You're talking about betraying the old ways that made us rich. Why should we risk everything on your legitimate ideas, Santino?" Santino's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. "Because I'm not the only one who believes in this. We've already started the process. We've already taken the first steps." At that, he turned to Rosalia, who stepped forward, unrolling a stack of papers onto the table. She'd been preparing for this moment, and now it was her time to speak. "We've filed the necessary corporate papers for several legitimate trusts. We've secured real estate acquisitions, and the first phase of the redevelopment project is already in motion," she said, her voice clear, confident, and unyielding. "These assets are already being moved into positions that can support long-term growth without relying on criminal enterprises. Santino's plan isn't just theoretical, it's actionable." For the first time, the room was quiet, each man looking at the papers in front of them, trying to make sense of the words that challenged everything they knew. The stakes were higher than they'd ever imagined. They couldn't just ignore this anymore. Santino's plan had taken root, and there was no turning back now. But Don Marco, who had always been Santino's closest confidant, looked across the table with a sneer. "So this is how it is, Santino? You've already made the moves behind our backs, gone behind our backs, and now you want us to just roll over and let you control everything?" Marco's voice was filled with venom, but it was clear he wasn't just angry. He was terrified. He saw the shifting balance of power. He saw Santino moving toward something that Marco didn't understand, something that threatened his hold over the organization. Santino stood tall, his gaze hard. "No, Marco, I'm not asking you to roll over. I'm asking you to evolve. We all know the old ways aren't working anymore. But some of you are so wrapped up in your fear of change that you can't see what's right in front of you." Don Vincenzo slammed his hand on the table, cutting through the tension. "Enough of this nonsense. We've heard you, Santino, and we've considered your plan. But it's not just about money. It's about loyalty, respect, tradition. The 5 families are built on power, not legality, and we won't let you destroy that." With a nod from Don Vincenzo, the council members stood. They had made their decision. Santino's plan had been officially rejected. The decision was final. They had spoken, and Santino, who had once commanded their respect, was now deemed a liability. Santino's heart raced as he looked around the room. His world, his future, hung in the balance, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He turned to Rosalia, who had remained quiet, her face stoic, her eyes steady as she processed the rejection. "This isn't over," Santino said, his voice low, filled with determination. "We have one last move to make." He wasn't defeated. He was just getting started. As they left the meeting, Rosalia could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them both. The 5 families had rejected their vision for the future, but Santino hadn't given up. He wasn't about to let them pull him back into the darkness. "What now?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with the weight of everything they had just gone through. Santino turned to her, his eyes locked onto hers. "Now, we move forward. We make this transition irreversible. We've already done the hard part. We just need to finish what we started." But as they walked through the empty halls of the meeting room, the question loomed large in Rosalia's mind. What had they really won? They were on their own now. Their next move would be their most dangerous yet. The hospital room was cold, sterile, and suffocating in its silence. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound that seemed to fill the air, keeping time with Rosalia's restless thoughts. She stood beside Santino Matteo's bed, her fingers trembling slightly as she held a manila envelope close to her chest. The contents of the envelope were heavy with the weight of truth, truth that had been buried for years, wrapped up in lies and betrayal. Santino lay unconscious, the bandages wrapped around his torso where the bullet had struck him only hours ago. The doctors had assured her he would survive. He was stable for now, but Rosalia knew better than anyone that stability could be fleeting in this world. He had taken a bullet meant for her, and now, as she watched his chest rise and fall with shallow breaths, she couldn't help but wonder if he had made the ultimate sacrifice just to keep her alive. Her gaze flicked to the envelope in her hands, the ledger, proof of everything Santino had denied. It held the detailed accounts of her father's manipulated debts, debts tied to Marco's betrayal. Her father had been played, just like she had feared. The weight of the knowledge threatened to crush her, but she held firm, knowing that this moment was pivotal. This was the truth, the moment she had dreaded and hoped for in equal measure, the moment everything would change. She pulled up a chair beside the bed, carefully setting the envelope down on the edge of the table. Santino's face was pale, a stark contrast to the man she had come to know over the past few months. There was a vulnerability in his stillness now that she had never seen before, something raw and exposed, something human. Taking a deep breath, Rosalia carefully unfolded the letter she had hidden in the folds of the ledger. It was a letter her father had written before his death, before everything had fallen apart. She had kept it all these years, her only connection to the man who had been taken from her too soon. She hadn't opened it until now, until she had no choice but to face it. The words were jagged, written in the hurried, illegible script of a man who had been running out of time. His words bled onto the paper, and as she read them, they rang out with painful clarity. Rosalia. If you're reading this, it means I've gone. The weight of the debts I've taken on is too much for me. The interest is growing, and they won't stop until I pay. But I couldn't stop, because I know what they're doing. They are corrupt, all of them. Santino, his men, Marco, they've all played me like a fool. I've been gathering evidence, piecing it together bit by bit. But I can't keep going. The last of the money I borrowed is gone, and now I'm on the edge of being ruined forever. I've sold what little I had left. But I hope you'll understand why. I did this for you. I did this to keep you safe. Don't let them win. Don't let them think they control everything. I love you, my daughter. I'm sorry. Rosalia's breath caught in her throat. Her father's final words, so full of regret, echoed in her mind. He hadn't been a fool. He had known what was happening. He had known that Santino's empire, the empire that had broken their family, had been built on lies. But he had tried to expose it, tried to stop it. And now she was left with the bitter reality of everything that had happened. She placed the letter on the table beside the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest as she gazed at Santino. He was still unconscious, but his face, his expression, was softer than she had ever seen it. He wasn't the cold, calculating mafia boss she had first met. In this moment, he was just a man who had sacrificed everything for the sake of his empire, for the sake of his redemption. And now she had to decide what to do with the truth. The minutes ticked by slowly. Rosalia's mind was racing, caught between conflicting emotions. She knew what Marco had done. He had betrayed her father, manipulated him into a game he couldn't win. But Santino? Was he complicit in that betrayal, or was he a victim of it too? He had been raised in this world, a world of crime and bloodshed. But was there more to him than that? Was there a chance for redemption? Her fingers grazed the edge of the ledger once again, but this time she was no longer sure of what she should do. The FBI had made their offer, promising immunity and protection if she helped take Santino down. But after everything they had been through, after everything he had done for her, could she betray him like that? Could she destroy the one person who had tried to build something better, even if it meant going against everything he had known? She looked down at Santino, his face pale, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of what he had been carrying. His empire was built on violence, and his world was collapsing. But his heart was more fragile than she could have ever imagined. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open, and Rosalia's breath caught in her throat. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition, of understanding. "Rosalia," he whispered hoarsely, his voice rough. "You're here." She nodded, swallowing hard, trying to steady the storm inside her. "I'm here." His hand weakly reached for hers, his fingers trembling. I didn't think I'd make it, not after all the things I've done." He paused, wincing with pain as he shifted in the bed. "I wanted to change. I wanted to build something real. Something that would last even after I'm gone. I'm trying, Rosalia. I'm trying to make up for it." Her heart twisted in her chest. This was the man she had come to know, the man who had offered her everything in the name of redemption. And now, as he lay in that bed, bloodied and broken, she realized that he wasn't just fighting for his empire. He was fighting for something more. He was fighting for a future, for a life that wasn't just about survival. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. Not after everything they had been through. Santino's eyes met hers, filled with a quiet desperation. I'm sorry, Rosalia. I never meant for things to go this far. I never meant for your father to suffer. I never meant for you to get caught up in this. He breathed out, a strained chuckle escaping his lips. I was trying to make it right. But I was too late. Rosalia's chest tightened as she fought back the tears. He wasn't just apologizing for his past mistakes. He was apologizing for her family's destruction, for her father's death. I know, she whispered. I know, Santino. But I also know that it's not too late. You can still change. We can still make this right. But you have to trust me. His gaze softened, the weight of his confession sitting heavy between them. I do trust you, Rosalia. You've always seen the truth in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. Rosalia swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the envelope on the table. She handed him the ledger, the contents heavy with the burden of betrayal. This is the truth, Santino. This is everything my father tried to tell me. He knew what you were involved in. He knew what Marco had done. He was trying to protect me, trying to protect us. Santino's eyes fell on the ledger, his face hardening as he flipped through the pages. When he saw the entries, his expression darkened, and for the first time, she saw the guilt in his eyes, a guilt he had carried with him for years, but never shared with anyone, not even her. I never meant for this to happen, he said again, his voice strained with emotion. But I can't change what I've done. I can't bring your father back. I can't undo the damage I've caused. Rosalia leaned forward, her voice steady. No, but we can make it right. We can fix this, Santino. We can take down Marco. We can take down the system that hurt our families. We can build something new together. The chapter ended with Rosalia making her decision. She had the power to destroy everything Santino had built, to expose him to the FBI and take the deal they had offered her. But as she looked at him, her heart aching with the knowledge of what he had sacrificed, she made a choice. She would help him. She would help him redeem himself. But the cost would be high. Higher than either of them could have ever imagined. Chapter 9. Redemption and Legacy. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in the hospital when Santino had been shot and everything had changed. The world they had known, the criminal empire built on blood and lies, was now a distant memory. The warehouse, the violence, the underworld dealings, those had been left behind. Instead, they were standing on something more solid, something more legitimate. Rosalia and Santino worked side by side in the sleek, modern offices of Matteo Holdings. The building itself was a symbol of their transformation. Glass walls that looked out over the city, the sunlight streaming in, reflecting off the polished floors and cutting-edge technology. It wasn't a mafia lair. It wasn't a place of illicit dealings. It was a business. A company focused on urban redevelopment, private equity, and real estate. Industries where they could build something that would last, something that could withstand time and scrutiny. Santino stood by the window in his tailored suit, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out over the city skyline. The view was breathtaking. The towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, all under the protection of the legitimate world he was now a part of. Rosalia stood beside him, reviewing documents on her tablet, a quiet presence of control beside him. It wasn't easy, and there were days when both of them wondered if they were really free from the ghosts of their pasts. But the work they were doing, transforming neglected properties, revitalizing neighborhoods, creating sustainable, affordable housing, felt like a true accomplishment. You've been quiet today, Rosalia remarked as she studied the figures on her screen. Everything all right? Santino glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Just thinking. It's hard to believe we're here, you know. Yeah, she said, her voice soft but steady. Sometimes it still feels like we're on the verge of something breaking. But we're not. We're building. Santino turned to face her, his expression serious. Do you think we've really left it all behind? The families, the debts, the danger? It's hard to believe we've actually made it. I don't know, Rosalia admitted, her fingers hovering over her tablet. But we have each other. And we have this, Matteo Holdings. We've built it from the ground up, and it's real. We're finally doing something that matters." He nodded, his gaze drifting toward the city again. The streetlights glowed in the distance, and for a moment he felt an unfamiliar calm wash over him. He had been born into a world of power, wealth, and crime. But this was different. This was something he had fought for, and it wasn't based on the fragile power of the Mafia. It was based on something solid, something that would endure. But even as they settled into this new life, the shadows of their past still loomed, and the FBI wasn't finished with the 5 families yet. The case against the Mafia families had been moving steadily forward. Agents had gathered evidence, interviewed informants, and built a case they were sure would bring them all down. But there was one thing the FBI hadn't anticipated: Santino. Despite their attempts to pressure him, despite their offers of immunity for Rosalia, Santino had refused to cooperate. He had stood firm, even as his health deteriorated and his empire crumbled around him. He refused to testify. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. For the FBI, it was a frustrating reality. Without Santino's testimony, the case against the families was incomplete. But as the months passed, the families had started to recognize the power of legitimacy, and instead of destruction, they chose survival. Santino's plan had been slow, but it was working. The 5 families, realizing they couldn't hold on to their old world any longer, had begrudgingly agreed to a deal. They would accept Santino's transition into legitimate business, and in return, they would be spared the worst of the FBI's wrath. The final blow came during an official meeting in Washington where the heads of the 5 families gathered to finalize their agreement with the FBI. The families, as powerful as they were, knew that their time in the underworld had passed. The future was in clean money, in real estate, in corporate ventures. And as they signed the papers, they tacitly agreed to leave the old ways behind. But that didn't mean they were safe. The FBI had their sights set on bringing down the rest of the organization, slowly, carefully, with legal precision. And for Santino, that meant his past would always haunt him, but he no longer had to fear the weight of his empire collapsing in one explosive night. They had found a way to protect their family's wealth, their assets, their legacies. A week later, Rosalia and Santino stood together in a small, quiet cemetery, the sun sinking low on the horizon as the evening light bathed everything in a soft golden glow. Rosalia had insisted they come here to visit her father's grave. She hadn't been back in years, not since the day she had learned about his death. And now, with everything that had happened, it felt like the right time to lay the past to rest, once and for all. Santino stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the silver necklace she wore, a simple chain with a heart-shaped pendant that had been her mother's. Passed down to her when she was a child, she had kept it close, as a reminder of her family's love, even when it seemed like everything had been lost. "This is where it all started," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father was buried here, and I was left to pick up the pieces, but now it feels like we've come full circle." Santino looked at her, his expression serious. "I can't imagine what you've been through, Rosalia. Losing your father the way you did. I understand why you've always been so guarded, but you don't have to carry that weight anymore." She nodded, staring at the headstone. The name Carmine was etched into the stone, and though the letters were faded, the memories were sharp. "I've spent so much of my life angry at him for what happened, but now I understand. He didn't choose to go down that path. He was trying to protect me, and I never saw it until now." Santino stepped closer, his presence a quiet strength at her side. He reached over and took her hand in his, gently brushing his thumb over the silver necklace she wore. "Your father did what he thought was right, and so did I. We both made mistakes, but we're not the same people we were. We've built something that's real now." Rosalia's gaze shifted to him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. The anger, the resentment, the years of pain, they were still there, but they were fading, replaced by something else, something soft, something fragile. And in that moment, she realized just how much they had both changed, how much they had fought for this moment, for this future. "Together," she said softly, looking up at him. "Together," he repeated, squeezing her hand. As they stood side by side looking at her father's grave, Rosalia felt a sense of peace settle over her, one she hadn't thought possible. They had paid a price for the life they had now, for the life they had fought to build, but they had paid it together, and in that there was a kind of redemption. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink as the final remnants of daylight faded into night. And for the first time in years, Rosalia felt a quiet hope settle in her chest, a hope that, despite everything, they had found a way to build a future, not just for themselves, but for the legacy they would leave behind. They turned away from the grave, hand in hand, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The story ended with them walking into the night, side by side, ready to build something that would last, a future built on redemption, love, and the unwavering belief that even the darkest pasts could be transformed into something meaningful. If you've enjoyed the journey of Santino and Rosalia's redemption, don't let the story end here. Join us as we continue to explore their transformation, where every decision, every sacrifice, and every new beginning is a step toward a future they never thought possible. Stay tuned for more twists, turns, and the ongoing battle for legacy. Follow for updates, and be sure to share your thoughts on how Santino and Rosalia's journey resonates with you. Remember, true redemption isn't just about the past, it's about building the future together.